All right, the last part of the four major categories of harm that come from compulsory rules. And I'm just going to start off. The fourth foul, confusion about how to solve problems. In the real world, there are no ultimate authorities on what is right and wrong. Nobody knows for sure how many hours of sleep we should get or what the ideal diet is. When confronted with a problem, there is no person who definitely has the answer. Instead, we are on our own, left to figure out for ourselves what is the best way forward. People and knowledge are available to help, but no one is infallible, and it is up to us to determine who to listen to and what information is reliable. In the adult world, we solve our own problems. From the most trivial to the most consequential, we are the authors of our own lives, or at least we aspire to be. Given this aspiration, it's hard to think of a more important gift to give our children than the confidence to be the authors of their own lives, to acquire the knowledge, skills, and assertiveness to take ownership of their own affairs. And this reveals the fourth foul of enforcing rules. It confuses kids by teaching them that there are external authorities who know the answers about how to live. It teaches them that when their interests conflict with those around them, the answer is to find the proper authority and do what they say, rather than to resolve the conflict themselves. It subverts their own autonomy and orients them to an external locus of control. That's a big one. So, again, I keep on thinking, right? One of the common justifications for enforcing rules is that, right, safety concerns, concerns about career or learning or being polite or healthy. But what about a concern that a person might decide that what you do when things get tough is that you seek an external locus of control? You look for an external authority. Um, that's what worries me. It worries me that my kids would not see themselves as capable of figuring things out, um, capable. And of course, a big part of the pushback to this comes from people saying, well, we don't figure anything out completely on our own, right? We always incorporate knowledge from others and incorporate knowledge from tradition, etc. And in one sense, absolutely, we always build off of what is out there, most of it developed by other people. But we have to pick and choose um, which of the many sources of knowledge to use. Um, and so, right off the bat, even if you are using external sources of knowledge, you're choosing which ones to follow because there's always multiple in any given topic. So, um, so that should be framed as an internal choice, as an internal discovery. Even if you're selecting external authorities to follow, how are you choosing them? What are the reasons you're using? Ultimately, you're still employing and relying on reasons. And so, when you force rules on kids, when you're telling them that the reasons don't matter, that the only thing that matters is the right external authority, and in this case, it's your parents, um, you're telling them that in certain circumstances, perhaps most circumstances, perhaps all circumstances, you're telling them that the external authority is the guide. And I think that's a big right, that really affects how somebody lives their life. It's right. Being overweight would be a big deal, right? You wouldn't want your kids to eat too many cookies and become overweight. That's a right. That's true. Being overweight affects everything in your life. So is being somebody who doesn't trust themselves to figure things out, who doesn't see themselves as the author of their own lives. That's also huge, right? The things that we worry about because they impact everything in their life, right? So, health, um, how much you learn, whether you go to school, things like that. A sense of autonomy and a sense of um, security and self confidence is enormous as well. And so, all right, I'll keep going. Here, I'm using the word authority to refer to someone with purportedly definitive knowledge, what we informally call an authority on the subject. This is a conventional usage, but philosophically, it is nonsensical. In other words, an authority on a subject is a nonsensical phrase. No one has final, confirmed, unalterable knowledge on any subject. The word authority can also refer to a person vested or authorized with certain powers. This kind of authority is very real, and parents have this property as well. They are vested with legal powers as well as physical power over their kids. I'm not denying this at all. I am saying that children should be spared the nonsensical idea that parents have ultimate knowledge, but not the very real idea that their parents have certain powers. So that's a really huge distinction. The word authority is a little fuzzy as it's conventionally used. Um, there's basically real authorities and mythical authorities. Um, a police officer has real authority. A judge has real authority. A parent has real authority vested in them by the law and all these other structures. Those things are real and they're important. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't exist. I think people should have um, authorities. Authorities vested in them, again, for reasons, not just arbitrarily. The king doesn't just say, you are the tax collector. Instead, the populace, votes and all that stuff. And we can get into that. But you don't just arbitrarily get authority, but nonetheless, um, authority is real in that sense. But the authority on a subject, a person whose credentials or whose training or whose education or whatever else about them makes their statements more likely to be true, or certainly 100% likely to be true, that's nonsensical. The the credential does not make what you say more likely to be true. Um, and we could get into the details on this, but um, well, I'll leave it at that. The credential doesn't make you what you say true, and nobody has absolute, unquestioned um, certainty of knowledge about anything. Um, all right. And so when we're sorting out what's right and wrong, the appeal to authority, the appeal to the knowledge a certain person has, is never a valid appeal. It's never a rational appeal. Instead, the appeal should be who has the right ideas, whose ideas are best account for all of the things going on. And so everything should always be adjudicated according to a collision of ideas, a collision of reasons, and never simply a collision of personages or status or etc. On the other hand, a judge is a person who can say uh, guilty or innocent, can declare it. Again, they have to use reasons, they have to appeal to certain processes. There are appeals to those processes, etc. There's an entire system. This is a rational system. It's not an arbitrary system. Okay. The goal is for children to be free of limitations set upon them by external authorities of knowledge, or so-called authorities of knowledge. But that's not to say we pretend they are totally free from constraints. So this is another major concept. And I've said this multiple times now. I'm a fan of constraints. Constraints can be productive, useful, helpful, even liberating. So there's good constraints and there's bad constraints. And I'm a fan of good constraints, but I'm a critic of bad constraints. And so here, what we don't want is for children to be limited by authorities of knowledge, or so-called authorities of knowledge. But we do want them to be exposed to various productive, positive, good constraints. We want kids to operate within the constraints of the natural world. Indeed, they have no choice but to accept gravity and the hardness of concrete. And we want them to operate within some of the constraints of the interpersonal world. So the natural world is easy because the constraints are there, whether regardless of what the rules are or anything else. Gravity will always influence, and hardness of concrete, etc. These things are there and will mete out their consequences regardless of what our parenting strategy is. Um, but there are also constraints of the interpersonal world that we also want kids to operate within, like the constraints of politeness, for example, or even language. Language is a set of constraints on the sounds that make sense, right? And I could sit here and babble at you, or I could limit myself to certain phonemes with certain words arranged in certain order and certain syntax, etc. And as I operate within those constraints, you could understand what I'm talking about. So the constraints of language, the constraints that language impose on the sounds that you issue out of your mouth or write on a piece of paper, those constraints increase your freedom. And what's also quite wonderful about a language is that it is easy to opt out. And that's what I'm going to get here. The difference between um, productive constraints and constraints that limit, or the unproductive ones, or the ones we don't want kids to be exposed to, is we want sets of constraints that they can opt out of. The rules of a game you can opt out of. You don't have to play. You can go do something else if you want. Or while you're playing, you can say, let's shift these rules. Let's modify them like this or like that. If you're speaking a language, you can decide to make up new words with your friends. You can play around with different forms of expression, right? Poetry, etc. You can experiment with certain um, lyrical uses of the language. Oftentimes it's not going to work. Sometimes it does work. It's quite profound when it does. So yes, interpersonal constraints in the interpersonal world. Specifically, there are two kinds of good interpersonal constraints: other people's boundaries and constraints that kids accept voluntarily. So boundaries are very interesting, right? Boundaries are um, limits that someone sets upon themselves, what they are willing to give of their time, of their property, of their attention, etc. So I can draw a boundary and say, my neighbors can come over and play in my backyard, but they can't come in my house and use my bathroom. Or if I'm living with somebody, I can say, I don't want you to use my dishware. Or right, you get the idea. You draw a boundary. I'll let you use borrow this shirt, but not the rest of my clothes. Um, and so I'll get to later. I think boundaries are essential, and it's essential that kids set their own boundaries and be allowed to exert control over their boundaries. And boundaries are a set of interpersonal constraints. It's useful, it's helpful when people communicate and signal what their boundaries are. That makes it easier to interact. If I don't know what your preferences are around how much noise we're making, or conversation, or approaching personal space, things like that, then I'm going to make you uncomfortable in certain circumstances without knowing ahead of time. And if you can't communicate that to me, if you just start yelling at me without explaining that I got too close or I invaded your personal space, I'm not going to know what it was that got you upset. Maybe I'm not going to want to hang out with you. It's going to limit our freedom of interaction if I can't understand what your boundaries are. So um, we want kids to both demonstrate their own boundaries as constraints on others, what others can do, and also be aware of other people's boundaries. And that promotes peace and harmony, which we'll get to in the siblings chapter. All right, and then the other type of interpersonal constraint, good interpersonal constraint, is any constraint that a kid accepts voluntarily, such as the rules of a game or the rules of politeness or language, etc. So that's the hallmark there. Anytime a kid has to accept a interpersonal constraint that is not voluntary, um, that is not somebody else's boundary, that is a problem. I'm sure I'm missing something in there. I'm sure there's other kinds of constraints. I'd be impressed if I came up with these two types of interpersonal constraints that are good and all the other types are not good. But that's what I've got so far. So really it's three types of constraints that are good: constraints of the natural world, boundaries and voluntary constraints you can opt out of. I can't opt out of somebody else's boundaries. That's not what a boundary is. All right, but about somebody else's boundary is a statement about their own property, which I don't have any claim to. Okay, in general, we want kids to understand the natural world, to respect other people's boundaries, and to accept the interpersonal constraints that they understand and reject those that they don't understand. This voluntary engagement helps ensure that their knowledge grows organically, genuinely, under their own control, and with minimal distortion and confusion by arbitrary and contrived rules. That's a big one. Um, I think it's clear as advice for an adult. Imagine an adult child. You don't want your child to grow up and be the kind of person who does things that they don't understand just because they're supposed to. We want them to question and ultimately have the self confidence, the backbone to reject stuff that doesn't make sense to them and opt out of it until they get it. Um, I mean, some clarifications here. Sometimes you would go along with something that you don't understand simply because, for the stated purpose of harmony, for now, while I'm visiting the in laws, I'm going to play ball, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I'm going to be kind of an agreeable person over the short term in order to be pleasant to be around and support my spouse or something like that. But in the long term, certainly I don't just do things because I'm told, especially things that grate on me, especially things that I don't like. And instead, um, when I'm have this conflict where I'm feel compelled or forced or pressured to do something that I don't agree with, um, I figure out ways to problem solve. I figure out ways to make it better. I don't just knuckle under. And it's kind of funny because it's a lot of what the um, like the willpower advocates or the hustle porn advocates, press for, right? No pain, no gain. You got to fight through that shit, right? You got to work hard to, stay fit or avoid this or that temptation. That's actually the same argument that you would make. You're basically saying that you have to do something that you don't quite understand, you don't quite agree with. You have to just force yourself. And I think that's quite obviously a mistake in terms of self confidence in certain areas, right? You wouldn't want, again, a friend to work a job and do what their boss tell them to do, even though it made them feel uncomfortable or it was unpleasant in some way. You'd want them to have the backbone, the confidence to question that, to stand up for themselves, to improve their work situation, um, something along those lines, to advocate for themselves. And so, same thing with an exercise regimen. We don't want, wouldn't want somebody to bully themselves into exercising and being healthy. Find some other way, right? If running is so important, but I really don't want to run, what is it about this that's making me so resistant? And is there a way to fix it or improve it? That's much more likely to result in a long-term love of exercise and running and staying healthy and fit and all that, rather than it being always a continual battle. All right. For the most part, our culture celebrates autonomy, self assertion, and a can do attitude. Yet kids are raised to deny, suppress, and control this instinct. Most modern parents know the value of modeling the behaviors they want to see in the world, but they often model authoritarianism and conformity by making kids stick to limits that they don't understand and that are chosen by purportedly all-knowing parents. So, right, if we want to model, I hear this all the time, how wonderful modeling is, and sure, but what about modeling anti-authoritarianism? Um, what about right? Every time you force a rule, you are, regardless of what the rule is about, it could be about food, screens, sleep, whatever it is, drugs. When you enforce the rule, you are sending the message that might makes right, that authorities call the shots, that there are people that just know, and you should do what they say. That's a valid thing in the world. I mean, that's what school is, right? School is just a nonstop lesson in the idea that um, doing what the authorities say is the best thing to do. um, right? And it's the opposite of self-assertion and a can-do attitude. Um, all right. We raise kids in a kind of training environment where they need to conform to authorities, and then we release them into the world, hoping that they suddenly make the mental pivot to figuring things out for themselves. Yeah, why? Why do we do that? Why wait until they're grown to switch from saying, "Do what the authorities say, do what I say," to you can figure this out yourself? Why not support them in figuring things out themselves from the very beginning? Um, right? Like I'm not saying you neglect the kid, right? But the kid can experiment with making their own choices, and you pick up the pieces rather than forcing the correct choices on them. I'm not saying we should leave children entirely on their own to figure things out with no parental input. I'm saying there is a way to help people without impairing their agency. And that's what the magic is. How do you help somebody without impairing their agency? We do that all the time with adults. Um, right? Adults ask each other for help all the time. We often offer help even without being asked, but we know that we have to do it delicately, and you don't want to just offer help and just barge in there and assume that the person is going to is welcoming your advice and will follow along your advice, and we don't get pissed when people don't take our advice. I mean, obviously, we do get pissed when they don't take our advice sometimes, but that's wrong. If someone's not taking our advice, that's their prerogative, that's their choice, and it means that we haven't explained the advice clearly enough. We haven't persuaded them that it's correct. And we don't want people to go off and take actions about which they don't understand. Right? If I was giving somebody advice and they didn't quite get it, but they decided to go do it anyway, I would say, whoa, 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 right? That would be a disaster. Someone's going to buy a house and they're asking my advice and they're not really understanding what I'm saying, but they decide to go and buy the house anyway. I would like try to get them to say no, like don't buy that house until you get what I'm saying. So advice is tricky. It's fraught, and it's particularly fraught with kids, and it's particularly fraught with your own kids. Um, yeah, that is a major. I should have made this more clear in the book somewhere, but I would say advice where a kid does not understand what is being suggested is potentially disastrous. All right, we do this with friends and adult family all the time, offering guidance when it's asked for and even stepping in aggressively, albeit rarely, when we see impending disaster. And I'm not saying it's easy or that we should expect 100% success in safely preserving our kids' autonomy. I'm saying it is an achievable ideal worth striving for, not just in select areas, but in every domain of life. And when preserving autonomy is a top priority, not only can we get quite good at it, but our kids become more open to trusting our input. When they know we are not trying to take control and demote them to a minor role in their own lives, they are more open to our suggestions. And this is absolutely huge. My kids are, what, 6 and 7, the oldest right now? And they are really getting to the point where they take my suggestions very seriously. And it's easier and easier to persuade them because I've never tried to force anything on them. And so this investment in autonomy early on, uh, this investment in letting them make the choices and picking up the pieces, arranging circumstances in ways that they're not going to get hurt if they make this or that choice. Um, that investment early on, I mean, it's kind of easy, right? With a 12-month-old, it's pretty easy to rearrange things so that they don't get hurt. You have to be there, but you're there anyway. Um, and then as they get older and they get more capacity to do stuff, they are more they're also more open to your suggestions about how to avoid this or that misstep. Okay, the conclusion about all four categories, the foul four, all four categories of harm. Again, harm to relationship between parent and child, harm to the relationship between the child and themselves, confusion about the issue at hand, and then confusion about how to navigate the world and the world of authorities and constraints. If rules are as bad as I've said, why don't more people point to the rule induced scars from their childhood? Fortunately, many people correct the mistakes that were made during their childhood and don't harbor resentment or insecurity as adults. This is a favorable outcome, but it is not guaranteed and it still has some drawbacks. So, um, lots of people, despite being uh, forced to follow compulsory rules as kids, grow up to be adults with no real issues. That's true. But even so, it doesn't have to be that way. In other words, um, a kid may have corrected certain harms, um, but better not to ever have imposed those harms in the first place, right? Childhood could have been much more fun without the compulsory rules, even though in the long run they didn't do any damage. Well, we don't know um, what possibilities they could have achieved if they didn't have to spend effort, um, kind of redressing the harms that came from compulsory rules. Um, Even if childhood anguish is eventually overcome, it still exacts a cost. The degraded relationships and confusions described by the Foul Four may be restored, but until that state of restoration is reached, children still suffer the consequences and lost opportunities of rule enforcement. Yeah, so even if you can redress these harms, there are lost opportunities during that time. And, well, potentially deeper, richer relationships as well. Another drawback is that adults whose rules induced injuries have healed may nonetheless impose rules on their children. That's the other part. Um, you incur the damage of rules as a child, you get over them as an adult, but you think this is how childhood should be. So then you impose those rules on your children, um, perpetuating the cycle. It's kind of what happens. Getting rules imposed on us, then realize that that's unnecessary, interact with adults in ways that don't have compulsory rules, and then have kids, and then bring it all back. The common refrain that I turned out all right is not a good reason to impose the same conditions on someone else. The remnants of the Foul Four in our adult lives often go unrecognized. Adults' relationships with their parents may remain marked by judgment, defensiveness, and a lack of respect for autonomy. Many adults have hangups about food and sleep and struggle with unhealthy relationships with various temptations. Many adults worry that they are a bad person. Many adults are consumed by the rules and expectations of life rather than with life itself. That's the autonomy, the authority bit. Um, so here yeah. Our culture sugarcoats and obfuscates the harmful effects of rule enforcement, thereby preserving the primary tool parents use, thereby preserving the primary tool that parents and school teachers use to manage kids. The need to preserve these tools gives rule enforcement a lot of positive press. Whenever I've heard the following phrases, they have always been issued in a boastful, self congratulatory tone. I straightened him out. Time to set some ground rules. Oh, she'll get over it. You need to nip that in the bud. It's for her own good. He'll thank you when he's older. I taught him a lesson. Right? There's all these little phrases um, that are basically felt to be, positives, that are felt to be, I said self-congratulatory. Um, all of these are, all those ways of interacting with other people are degrading. Um, it's funny. There's like almost all of the kind of little nuggets of wisdom that get passed down from generation to generation about kids like what, spare the rod, spoil the child, and um, oh gosh, can't think of them all. They, they almost always reinforce the need for or justify um, applying rules. The only exception that I came across was all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. Pretty much all the other little kind of phrases and nuggets are justify authoritarianism. All right, last paragraph. Finally, the reasons kids have for doing what they do are invisible to parents. It is easy to have a false impression that a kid is complying because they agree with the rules, when in fact, many kids learn to simply say what their parents want to hear. After all, if you're never going to win, why raise a stink about it? The same goes internally. It's no fun feeling hostile toward the people you love. And one way to resolve this is to convince yourself that the rules they impose on you make sense. Imagine if kids could speak correctly and honestly about their feelings and thoughts as they comply with our rules. All right, that's the end of the chapter on the harms of rules, the four categories of harms, the foul four. And I thought about starting the book off with this chapter. And I think it's really useful to keep in mind. And I think it gets the harms of rules get um, ignored, swept under the rug, or written off as necessary evil. All right, that's all for now.